The road to Aldridge Manor was more like a scar carved into the earth than a path. Each turn seemed designed to dissuade travelers, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as if the forest itself disapproved of my intrusion. The dying light of the sun filtered weakly through the skeletal branches, casting distorted shadows that danced like specters on the windshield. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, ignoring the voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "Turn back." I wouldn't. I couldn't. The diner's patrons had told me little, though their silence had spoken volumes. The old man at the counter had clutched his coffee cup like a lifeline, his knuckles white against the cracked porcelain. "You don't want to go up there," he'd muttered without meeting my eyes. His warning had been echoed by the others. A waitress who refused to refill my coffee when I mentioned the manor, and a boy who dropped his fork at the mere mention of its name. It was cliché, almost laughably so, but their unease only fueled my resolve. If they were afraid of Aldridge Manor, it was my job to find out why. My editor had given me free rein to explore the most haunted places in New England, but this one, this cursed relic, wasn't just another paycheck. It was personal. My sister, Emma, had vanished 5 years ago under circumstances so eerily similar it made my skin crawl. She had been chasing whispers of haunted ruins when she disappeared. The authorities found no leads, no trace of her. Only her car, parked neatly at the edge of a forest like this one. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I could uncover the truth about Aldridge Manor, I might find a piece of her too. The manor revealed itself like a predator lying in wait. As I rounded the final bend, its jagged silhouette loomed against the horizon, blacker than the darkening sky. My headlights flickered, just for a moment, as if the house itself exhaled. I pulled up the gravel driveway and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of my cooling car. For a moment, I sat there, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, unsure if it was the cold or my nerves that made them tremble. The air outside was heavy, the kind of stillness that presses down on your chest and makes you feel unwelcome. I grabbed my flashlight and recorder from the passenger seat, slinging my bag over my shoulder. The tools of my trade felt woefully inadequate against the foreboding presence of the house. The front door loomed ahead, weathered and warped, its surface carved with symbols I couldn't identify. A faint smell of rot clung to the air. I hesitated, the rational part of me screaming to leave. But then I thought of Emma's smiling face, her eyes filled with that unyielding curiosity we shared. I pushed the door open, and it groaned like a wounded animal. The darkness inside seemed alive, curling around me like smoke as I stepped over the threshold. My flashlight barely pierced it, illuminating little more than the dust motes suspended in the stale air. The house felt like a mausoleum, every surface coated in the weight of years and sorrow. "Hello," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. It sounded absurd, echoing in the cavernous silence. Of course, no one answered. The smell was stronger here, a mix of damp wood and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. I tried to ignore the way the hair on my arms stood on end as I moved deeper inside. The foyer was massive, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. A grand staircase rose ahead of me, its banister splintered and sagging. To my left, an arched doorway led to what must have been a sitting room. My flashlight caught a flash of something shiny on the floor, broken glass. Then I saw them. The portraits. They lined the walls, their frames caked in dust, their subjects frozen in an eternal vigil. My light swept across their faces, each one more lifelike than the last. A woman in a high-collared dress, her eyes glinting with something almost human. A man with a twisted smile that seemed to widen as I stared. And then there was the child. Her frame was smaller than the others, and her painted eyes were wide and pleading. Her hand, resting on her lap, seemed to stretch out toward me. A chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes followed me as I turned away. This was just the beginning. The house hadn't even begun to whisper its secrets, but I could feel it. It was waiting for me. The door closed behind me with a soft, deliberate thud. I hadn't touched it, For a moment, I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound wasn't startling in itself, but it carried a finality that settled deep into my bones. The house had swallowed me whole, and the outside world felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. I raised my flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Dust particles danced in the air, swirling like restless spirits disturbed by my presence. The foyer stretched out before me, vast and silent, as though it had been waiting for decades just for this moment. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, the floral patterns barely visible beneath layers of grime. Somewhere above me, the faint creak of wood echoed, a noise too rhythmic to be random. I whispered to myself, "It's just the house settling," though my words did little to calm the unease gnawing at me. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. Every breath tasted like the remnants of old decay. I stepped cautiously forward, my boots scuffing against warped floorboards that groaned beneath my weight. The sound felt too loud, each step an intrusion into a place that didn't want me there. My flashlight flickered, just once, and for a brief second, the room plunged into complete darkness. I stood still, heart hammering in my chest, until the light steadied again. "Focus," I muttered, trying to push away the rising dread. I reminded myself that fear was a trick of the mind, a survival instinct gone rogue in the face of the unknown. But no amount of rational thought could shake the feeling that I was being watched. To my left, an arched doorway led to a sitting room. My flashlight revealed the remnants of a life long abandoned. A shattered tea set on a table, its porcelain pieces arranged as though the owner had meant to return but never did. A threadbare armchair sat by the window, facing a view obscured by grime-coated glass. The room was suffocatingly quiet, but there was something else, faint but unmistakable, the low hum of voices. I turned sharply, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the walls. There was no one there. The whispers were so faint they could have been my imagination, yet they seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, wrapping around me like invisible tendrils. I backed out of the room, instinctively retreating to the foyer. My hand brushed against the banister of the grand staircase, the wood smooth and cold beneath my fingers. It seemed to rise into infinity, its upper reaches disappearing into shadows. Against my better judgment, I began to ascend. The steps creaked beneath me, protesting each movement. With every step, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the house itself resisted my intrusion. My flashlight flickered again, its dimming beam revealing glimpses of the upper landing. A hallway stretched out ahead, its walls lined with doors that seemed to lead nowhere. Each one was closed, their surfaces warped and cracked, but the sense of something waiting behind them was suffocating. At the end of the hallway, one door stood slightly ajar. A faint sliver of light spilled out from within, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. I moved toward it, the urge to see what lay beyond stronger than my fear. My steps slowed as I approached, my breath shallow and uneven. I nudged the door open, and the room revealed itself reluctantly. It was a bedroom, smaller than I'd expected, its furnishings minimal and long neglected. A bed with a sagging mattress, a dresser with one drawer missing, and a mirror that hung crookedly on the wall. The light that had drawn me here came from a small oil lamp sitting on the nightstand. It flickered weakly, its flame impossibly steady for something that should have burned out decades ago. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch it, when the reflection in the mirror caught my attention. My own face stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but behind me, just over my shoulder, there was something else. A shadow. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it had been there. A shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, standing just behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, my flashlight sweeping across the room. There was nothing. The whispers began again, louder now, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. They filled the room, pressing against my ears, seeping into my thoughts. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the lamp, and bolted from the room. My footsteps echoed as I ran down the hallway, back to the staircase, the whispers chasing me every step of the way. When I reached the foyer, the silence returned, sudden and absolute. I stopped, gasping for breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. The house seemed to settle around me, its oppressive stillness a mocking contrast to the chaos I'd just fled. I looked back toward the staircase, the hallway above now swallowed in shadows once more. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. I had come here searching for answers, but the house had given me something else entirely, a warning. I wasn't welcome here, but something told me it was already too late to leave. The air inside Aldridge Manor carried an unsettling heaviness, as if it remembered too much and wanted none of it forgotten. Each step I took on the creaking floorboards was swallowed by the silence, a silence so profound it seemed to thrum in my ears. My flashlight traced the walls ahead of me, its beam illuminating the peeling wallpaper and forgotten relics of a life long abandoned. Then I heard it, faint at first, like the distant hum of wind slipping through a crack. It seemed more an impression than a sound. But as I stilled, straining to listen, it grew distinct, a whisper threading its way through the oppressive quiet. "Evelyn." The voice was impossibly soft, yet it felt close, like it had been spoken just over my shoulder. My stomach clenched, and a chill licked up my spine. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing, only empty air and the gnarled shape of an old coat rack in the corner. My mind is playing tricks on me, I thought, but the rationality felt thin, stretched against the weight of something deeper, older. My name in that voice, it wasn't just a coincidence. Pressing forward, I found myself in what appeared to be a sitting room. The fireplace at its center was choked with ash, its mantel crowded with candlesticks melted into grotesque shapes. The room felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, as though the air itself carried the faint residue of a scream. I knelt by a pile of yellowed papers strewn across the floor. They crumbled at my touch, but a few still bore the faint scratches of handwriting. The words were jagged, rushed, written by a hand in despair. Most were illegible, but one phrase leapt out with sickening clarity. "They watch even when they don't speak." The whisper came again, closer this time. "Evelyn." I froze. The voice wasn't just disembodied. It carried a weight that pressed against my chest. I spun around again, flashlight in hand, and this time I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow slipping out of the room and into the hallway beyond. "Who's there?" My voice was steadier than I expected, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. No answer. I stepped into the hallway. It stretched on endlessly, the darkness at its far end swallowing my flashlight's beam. Doors lined the walls, some ajar, others closed tight. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic that scraped at the back of my throat. My flashlight flickered. Panic flared in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm, shaking the device until the beam steadied. The shadows ahead seemed to shift with the pulse of light, as though they were alive, retreating just enough to remain unseen. I reached for one of the doors on my right. Its handle was ice cold, and as I turned it, the door swung inward with a low groan. Inside was a child's room, or what was left of it. A small bed sat against the wall, its frame rusted, its mattress sagging and discolored. Toys littered the floor, their colors faded, their forms warped by time. A doll lay on the bed, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. I picked it up hesitantly, its tiny frame unnaturally heavy in my hands. A faint sound escaped it, a childlike giggle, soft and mechanical, triggered by some ancient mechanism within. My stomach twisted, and I dropped it back onto the bed. That's when the whisper turned into a hiss. "Evelyn." The voice slithered around the room, no longer faint but sharp and deliberate, coming from everywhere at once. My name felt like a curse on its tongue. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun toward it, but the handle refused to budge. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, creeping toward me like spilled ink. My flashlight flickered again, its beam stuttering in the darkness. "Why are you here?" the voice rasped. It was no longer a whisper, but a guttural, venomous thing, the words scraping against my sanity. "I don't know," I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadows halted, as though considering my answer. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the beam of the flickering light. The voice softened again, mocking now, almost gentle. You do. You've always known. My heart thundered as I scanned the room, desperate for any sign of its source. Then the doll, the cracked and lifeless doll, turned its head. Its single remaining eye locked onto mine, and its mouth moved, forming words that didn't belong to it. Leave while you can. The door flew open with a force that knocked me off my feet. I scrambled to my knees, my flashlight clattering to the floor but remaining on. The hallway beyond was empty, silent, but I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my flashlight, I ran. The house seemed to shift around me as I moved, its walls leaning closer, its floors groaning in protest. The shadows chased me. I was sure of it, their shapes skittering along the edges of my vision. When I finally stopped, I found myself back in the foyer. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the flashlight again. The silence was back, but it wasn't the same. The house wasn't just silent. It was waiting. The study was a room trapped in time. The furniture, though blanketed in a thick coat of dust, seemed untouched by decay compared to the rest of the house. The desk was a massive thing, carved from some dark, unyielding wood, its surface cluttered with quills, faded ink bottles, and yellowing paper. Against one wall stood a bookshelf, its contents sagging under the weight of leather-bound tomes with titles in languages I couldn't recognize. This room felt different. Unlike the rest of the house, which carried an aura of neglect, the study seemed cared for, as if someone or something still used it. I approached the desk with slow, deliberate steps. The floorboards didn't creak here, which was unsettling in itself. My flashlight swept over the papers, catching glimpses of faded handwriting. Most were illegible, smudged by time or the damp, but one item stood out. A journal, its leather cover cracked but intact, rested at the center of the desk, as though waiting for me. I hesitated, a knot forming in my stomach. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it untouched, to turn around and walk away. But I didn't come here to be cautious. My hand hovered over the journal for a moment before I picked it up. The leather was cool against my skin, the weight of it heavier than I expected. When I opened the journal, the smell of old paper filled my nostrils. The handwriting was elegant at first, neat and controlled, though the ink had faded to a rusty brown. The first entry was dated October 13th, 1887. This house, my creation, is the legacy I leave to those who come after me. It is not merely a structure of stone and timber, but a sanctuary, a monument to the strength of the Aldridge line. My family will endure within these walls forever. The words felt heavy, their meaning veiled in an unsettling ambiguity. I flipped forward, skimming entries about construction costs and estate management. Then the tone shifted. October 31st, 1888. They mock me. My own blood mocks me. They do not see the brilliance of my design. They do not understand what I have built for them. But they will. In time they will. The handwriting grew more erratic as I turned the pages, the elegant loops and flourishes degenerating into jagged lines. The words became darker, filled with resentment and a strange obsession with the concept of permanence. December 12th, 1888. They tried to leave me, ungrateful wretches. But this house is their home. It is their tomb. They will remain, as I intended, and they will come to understand. A chill prickled at the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that Victor wasn't just writing for himself. It felt as though his words were meant for me. The final entries were barely legible, the ink smeared as though written in a frenzy. March 4th, 1889. They are with me now, bound as they should be. The ritual is complete. The house breathes. The house lives. It will protect me. It will protect us. March 5th, 1889. But it demands more. It hungers. It whispers to me in the night, calling for others to join us. It is not satisfied with just them. It never will be. The words dissolved into meaningless scrawls, as though Victor had lost his grip on sanity entirely. I closed the journal with shaking hands, the sound of the leather snapping shut echoing in the room. The air felt heavier now, oppressive. The house was silent, but I could feel it watching me, listening. As I set the journal down, The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in front of me, and a shiver ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but a faint whisper stopped me in my tracks. "Do you see now?" The voice was male, smooth and cold, spoken directly into my ear. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but I was alone. The room had changed. The bookshelves now loomed closer, their shadows stretching unnaturally toward me. The desk seemed larger, more imposing, as though it had grown roots into the floor. And the journal. It was open again. My pulse quickened. I was certain I'd closed it, but the cover was thrown back, its pages fluttering as though an invisible hand was rifling through them. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move, rooted to the floor by a fear I couldn't overcome. The pages stopped, revealing a single line scrawled in ink so fresh it glistened in the flashlight's beam. "You cannot leave. You are part of the house now." The desk groaned like a living thing, and the shadows deepened around me. A sound, faint at first, began to grow, a low, guttural breathing, as though the house itself was alive and exhaling around me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I fled the study, slamming the door behind me. The sound echoed through the house, but the breathing followed, growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The journal's words burned in my mind. The house wasn't just a house. It was something more, something alive, and it wasn't going to let me go. The silence in the manor wasn't the absence of sound. It was an active, oppressive force, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Every step I took felt amplified, the creak of the wooden floorboards spreading like ripples in a black, bottomless pool. I moved cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the thick gloom, its beam flickering with a faint irregularity that made me grip it tighter. The sitting room was an exercise in decay. Faded floral wallpaper peeled from the walls in curling strips, exposing wood stained with water and time. A fireplace stood empty, its charred interior like a gaping mouth, as if it had consumed more than logs over the years. My gaze wandered to the cracked mirror above it, an antique relic that distorted my reflection, twisting my features into something unfamiliar and unsettling. That was when I saw it. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint movement in the corner of my eye like a smudge on the edge of my vision. My head snapped toward the source, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing there. Only the empty room, with its sagging furniture and lingering shadows. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, though the words did little to slow my racing pulse. I took a step forward, scanning the room with deliberate precision. That's when the air shifted. It wasn't a breeze. There was no wind, no draft to explain it. It was as if the room itself had exhaled, and the breath brushed against the back of my neck. "Evelyn!" The voice was barely audible, yet it struck me with the force of a scream. A man's voice, smooth and measured, laced with something I couldn't quite place, something ancient and wrong. It wasn't a sound that belonged in this world. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight darting wildly. My hands shook as I strained to see past the suffocating dark, but the room remained still. Then I noticed the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and wavering. But it wasn't me. My posture was wrong, my head tilted at an unnatural angle. And behind me, just beyond the edge of the glass, was a figure. It wasn't a shadow, though it moved like one, fluid and shapeless, yet impossibly solid. The figure loomed, its presence stretching taller than the room should allow. My reflection's eyes widened in terror, mirroring the scream caught in my throat. I whirled around, but the space behind me was empty. My flashlight flickered again, its beam sputtering weakly before plunging me into momentary darkness. Panic surged as I smacked the side of the flashlight, the brittle plastic cracking under my grip. When the light returned, the figure was there. It stood across the room, no longer a fleeting shadow but a tangible form. A man, or something that had once been a man, dressed in clothes decades out of place. His face was obscured, his features shrouded in a darkness that defied the weak glow of my flashlight. But his presence was undeniable, an overwhelming pressure that bore down on me like the weight of the ocean. "You've come," he said, his voice no louder than a whisper, yet it filled the room. My breath hitched as he took a step forward. The sound of his movement was wrong, too soft, as if his feet barely touched the floor. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam quivering as it tried and failed to capture the full shape of him. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse and trembling. His head tilted slightly, an unnervingly human gesture that somehow made him more alien. "To welcome you," he said. "You've come to join us, haven't you?" I stumbled back, the edge of a decrepit chair catching the back of my knees and nearly sending me sprawling. My mind raced, grasping for a plan, an escape, anything to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no logic here, no explanation that fit within the confines of reality. The figure didn't move again, but the air grew heavier with each passing second. I felt it pressing against my chest, stealing the oxygen from my lungs. I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran. The house seemed to shift as I moved, the hallway stretching impossibly long, its walls closing in. The sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the suffocating silence, leaving only the pounding of my heart in my ears. Behind me, the faint sound of laughter followed, a low, guttural chuckle that made my skin crawl. When I reached the foyer, I slammed against the front door, clawing at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The wood was ice-cold beneath my fingers, unyielding as stone. Desperation clawed at me as I threw myself against it, screaming for release. But the house had other plans. The last thing I saw before the light flickered out completely was a reflection in the window. Not mine, his. And he was smiling. The storm arrived without preamble, a sudden roar of wind and rain that slammed against the manor as if trying to tear it from the earth. Lightning illuminated the house in brief, violent flashes, and I saw its decayed grandeur more clearly than I ever wanted to. The windows rattled in their frames, and I felt the vibrations underfoot, as though the house itself was reacting to the storm. Or maybe it was feeding off it. I had been pacing the library, flipping through a journal I'd found on a desk, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that the walls were somehow closer than before. When the first clap of thunder shook the house, I nearly dropped the book. My heart raced as I glanced at the doorway, half expecting someone, or something, to step through. But there was only silence beyond the howl of the wind. I made my way to the front door, clutching the flashlight as if it were a weapon. The storm might be brutal, but it was preferable to staying here. My fingers closed around the rusted doorknob, slick with moisture from the drafts that seeped into the house, and I twisted hard. The door didn't budge. I tried again, putting my weight into it, but it was as if the wood had fused to the frame. My breaths came faster, fogging up the dim glass of the sidelights. I rattled the door, the sound jarring in the oppressive stillness. "No," I muttered. "No, this isn't happening." I turned to the nearest window, an arched frame smeared with dirt and grime. Pressing my hand against the cold glass, I felt for the latch and slid it open. Rain splattered against my face as the window cracked ajar, but before I could climb out, the frame slammed shut with violent force, narrowly missing my fingers. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the wind outside screamed like a wounded animal. A laugh echoed faintly behind me, low, male, and mocking. I froze. The sound wasn't distant, it was close. Too close. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark hallway behind me. Shadows danced on the walls, alive and restless, but nothing moved in the pale circle of light. My pulse thudded in my ears as I backed away from the window, now sealed tight as though it had never opened. "You can't keep me here," I said aloud, my voice breaking. "Do you hear me? You can't." Another crash of thunder drowned out my words, and the lights flickered violently before dying altogether. The house plunged into complete darkness, leaving only the faint hum of the storm and the panicked rasp of my breathing. I ran. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I stumbled through the labyrinthine hallways, my boots slipping on the warped floorboards. I tried doors as I went, throwing them open only to find rooms filled with decaying furniture and suffocating shadows. A dining room where cobwebs hung like funeral shrouds. A parlor with a grand piano whose keys seemed to press themselves, one by one, creating a melody I didn't recognize. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. My lungs burned, and I tried to force down the rising panic. The storm's fury outside was muffled here, and the silence was almost worse. My flashlight caught the gleam of a butcher's knife on the counter. I snatched it up, feeling absurdly comforted by its weight. I turned toward the doorway I had just come through, and froze. The hallway was gone. In its place was a wall, smooth and unbroken. My chest tightened, and I slammed my fist against it, desperate to prove it wasn't real. The sound was dull, muted, as if the wall absorbed every ounce of resistance. "You're not real," I whispered, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. The laugh came again, deeper this time, and it was accompanied by the faint scrape of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. My grip on the knife tightened as I turned in a circle, the kitchen now feeling impossibly small. My flashlight flickered again, and I slapped it against my palm, willing it to stay on. The footsteps stopped, and the voice spoke, low and velvety. "Why fight it, Evelyn? You belong here." I felt the blood drain from my face as the knife slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering onto the tiles. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stillness, and then the shadows began to move. They poured from the corners of the room, thick and viscous, sliding across the floor like living ink. My flashlight flickered once more before going out completely, and I was left in the dark, choking on fear. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the space shrinking around me as the shadows crept closer. I stumbled backward, hitting the counter hard enough to bruise. The laugh was all around me now, reverberating through the air like a low, resonant hum. The knife was gone, swallowed by the darkness. My hands searched frantically for something, anything. That could be a weapon, but the counter was empty. Then the voice spoke again, its tone almost gentle. "The storm will pass. But you'll never leave." I screamed, a raw, primal sound that seemed to tear through the oppressive silence. My voice echoed back at me, hollow and mocking, as the shadows surged forward. The basement door was almost an afterthought, tucked behind a decaying tapestry at the end of a narrow hallway. I only noticed it because the air in the corridor seemed heavier there, colder. The wood was warped, its surface etched with strange, curling marks that could have been claw marks, or something worse. I reached for the tarnished brass handle, my fingers trembling as I gripped it. The metal was icy, and the door creaked open with an unsettling, almost reluctant groan. The darkness beyond was absolute. My flashlight barely pierced it, illuminating the top of a staircase that plunged steeply into the void. The steps were uneven, the wood swollen and slick beneath my boots. The air here was different, thicker, saturated with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, metallic. Blood. I hesitated, the instinct to turn back pulling at me with every breath. But I thought of Victor's journal, the cryptic scrawls about family and secrets kept safe in the earth. Whatever was down there, it held the answers I'd come for, and perhaps more than I wanted to find. As I descended, the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my breathing, too loud in the narrow space. Each step felt like a descent into another world, one untouched by light or warmth. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stairs ended abruptly, and I found myself standing in a cavernous chamber. The walls were stone, slick and blackened with mold. Chains dangled from the ceiling, their rusted links swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt that muffled my steps, except where it gave way to bare, jagged rock. At first, I thought the shapes scattered across the room were debris, wooden beams or broken furniture. But as I moved closer, my flashlight revealed the truth. Bones. Dozens of them, bleached white and arranged with unsettling precision. They formed concentric circles, radiating out from a central pile, where skulls were stacked like a grotesque totem. The sockets stared at me, empty and accusing, their jagged edges catching the weak light. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. These weren't the remains of animals or ancient relics. The bones were fresh enough to still carry the faint, sickly sheen of marrow. And then I saw it. In the center of the macabre display was something far worse than the bones. It was a mirror, its surface black as oil and rippling like water. My flashlight's beam didn't reflect off it. It was swallowed whole, leaving the mirror untouched by light. As I approached, the air grew colder, the metallic tang on my tongue stronger. My own reflection didn't appear in the mirror. Instead, I saw figures, shadows that writhed and twisted as if trapped within. Faces materialized and dissolved, mouths open in silent screams. A voice broke the silence, low and distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You found it," it said, the words slithering into my ears like cold fingers. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty except for the bones and the mirror. "You came to join us," the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't leave now. You belong here." The shadows in the mirror surged, pressing against its surface as if they were trying to escape. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer, the air heavy and suffocating. And then I saw her. Among the shifting shadows in the mirror, a familiar face emerged. Emma. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth forming my name. "Evelyn," she mouthed, her voice faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing the icy surface of the mirror. Pain shot through my hand, sharp and searing, as if the glass had burned me. I yanked my hand back, staring at the angry red mark already forming on my skin. The voice laughed, deep and cruel. "She's part of the family now. And soon, you will be too." The chains above began to rattle, the sound echoing like 100 rusted screams. The air filled with whispers, angry, mournful, desperate. The dirt beneath my feet shifted, and I realized, with dawning horror, that something was moving beneath the surface. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the uneven ground. The whispers rose into a cacophony, and the room seemed to tilt, pulling me back toward the mirror. I reached the stairs and scrambled up them, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door slammed shut behind me as I burst into the hallway, and the whispers cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of my racing heartbeat. I collapsed against the wall, clutching my hand as the pain subsided. I had found the truth hidden in the earth, and it had nearly claimed me. The air in the basement was suffocating, thick with a metallic tang that coated my tongue. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced on the stone walls like grotesque puppets. The oppressive silence pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I clutched the journal tightly in one hand, the other holding the trembling beam of light steady. I had found it, the heart of the Manor's darkness. The room was circular, its stone walls lined with shelves of ancient, dust-caked relics. At its center was a low table piled with brittle, yellowed bones arranged in a macabre ritualistic pattern. Some were human, others I didn't want to identify. A faint humming seemed to emanate from the table, an almost imperceptible vibration that made my skin crawl. And then he was there. Victor Aldridge stepped from the shadows, his figure more solid than before, though disturbingly wrong. His decayed face bore the remnants of handsomeness, twisted by time and something far darker. His eyes, black pits that swallowed light, fixed on me with a predator's hunger. "You came so far, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft and insidious, as if he were a father scolding a wayward child. "You've proven yourself worthy." I took a step back, the journal heavy in my hand. My throat felt like sandpaper, but I forced the words out. "I know what you did, what you are." He smiled, a grotesque stretch of rotting flesh and yellowed teeth. "Do you? Or have you only seen what I allowed you to see?" The room darkened further, the humming intensifying until it was a droning vibration in my chest. Shadows poured from the walls, writhing like living creatures, coiling around my ankles, my wrists. They pulled at me, their touch icy and numbing. "You sought answers," Victor continued, circling me slowly. "But answers have a price. And you, my dear, are the final piece of my family." I fought against the shadows, their grip tightening as Victor raised a skeletal hand. His presence distorted the room, the edges of my vision blurring as if reality itself was bending under his will. My mind screamed at me to flee, but my body felt paralyzed, pinned under his gaze. Then I remembered the journal. Through the haze of panic, I forced myself to focus. The journal was my only weapon, its brittle pages filled with Victor's own rituals. I had spent hours deciphering his notes, piecing together the logic of his madness. If his power was tied to the house, then it could be severed. With trembling hands, I flipped through the pages, searching for the incantation I had hastily scrawled in my notebook. The shadows hissed as if sensing my intent, their cold tendrils digging into my skin. Victor's smile faltered. "You think you can stop me?" he hissed, his voice losing its calm veneer. I didn't answer. Instead, I began to read. My voice was shaky at first, barely above a whisper, but it gained strength with each word. The symbols and phrases spilled from my lips, foreign and jagged, their meaning lost to me, but their power unmistakable. The room erupted in chaos. The shadows recoiled, writhing and shrieking, their forms dissolving into black smoke. The bones on the table vibrated violently before shattering into dust. Victor screamed, a sound that was both human and monstrous, his figure flickering like a candle in a storm. "You don't understand," he roared, his voice layered with fury and desperation. "You cannot destroy me." I ignored him, my focus unbroken, as I finished the incantation. The journal in my hand grew hot, the pages curling at the edges. Without hesitation, I hurled it onto the table. The fire was instant, an explosion of heat and light that illuminated the room in an otherworldly glow. The flames climbed higher, consuming everything they touched. Victor's scream turned into a guttural wail, his form splintering and dissolving into the inferno. The room began to collapse. The walls trembled, stones crumbling as the fire consumed the cursed space. I stumbled toward the stairs, coughing as smoke filled my lungs. The heat scorched my skin, but I forced myself to climb, each step feeling like a mile. Behind me, Victor's voice rose one final time, distorted and otherworldly. "You will never escape me, Evelyn. Never." I burst into the open air, just as the manor began to implode, the flames spilling out of the shattered windows and devouring the ancient structure. I collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for breath as the storm drenched me. The house burned brightly against the night, its silhouette finally falling into itself. But even as I watched it crumble, Victor's last words echoed in my mind, chilling me far more than the rain ever could. The house was gone, but I wasn't sure he was. The air in the basement was suffocating, thick with damp and a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My flashlight flickers erratically, casting fractured beams of light across the walls, revealing the grotesque truth of the room. Bones. So many bones, arranged with chilling precision, mocking the idea of family. Chairs encircled a crumbling table, each one occupied by skeletal remains, their empty eye sockets staring at nothing. Victor had called them his family. I held the journal tighter, the leather cover slick with sweat from my trembling hands. Its pages had become my lifeline, a roadmap to unraveling the horrors that bound this house, and Victor, to this world. The words scrawled inside were maddening, almost incoherent, but one thing was clear. Destroying this room was the key. "You've come so far, Evelyn." Victor's voice slithered through the room like smoke, rich and mocking. I turned sharply, and there he was. No longer a shadow or a fleeting glimpse, but fully formed. His decayed skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, and his sunken eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. He looked at me not with malice, but with something far worse, possessive affection. "You're just like her," he continued, stepping closer. "Curious, brave, foolish." "Stay back," I managed, though my voice betrayed the fear tightening my chest. Victor tilted his head, his smile both knowing and cruel. "Do you think you can undo this? Undo me?" He gestured to the macabre scene around us, the skeletal family that seemed to lean forward as if waiting for the next act. I stepped back, my foot catching on something soft and yielding, a remnant of another victim long forgotten. My stomach turned, but I forced the bile back down. This was no time for weakness. "You've taken enough," I said, my voice firmer this time. "It ends here." Victor's laughter was low and resonant, filling the room and vibrating in my bones. "You think fire will save you?" He gestured to the walls, their stone surfaces seeming to pulse as though alive. This house is me, Evelyn. It will consume you long before the flames reach its heart. I ignored him, flipping to the journal's last entry. The words were maddeningly cryptic, but I understood enough. The fire had to begin at the table, at the center of his mock family. My shaking hands found the matches in my pocket. "You'll fail," Victor hissed, his form flickering like a dying light bulb. "You'll burn with the rest of them." His voice clawed at my resolve, but I struck the match. The flame sputtered to life, a fragile but defiant beacon. I dropped it onto the table, and the dry, rotting wood caught instantly. Fire raced across its surface, licking hungrily at the bones and devouring the tableau. Victor screamed, a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't just pain, it was fury, despair, and hatred woven into a single, soul-shaking wail. The walls began to tremble, cracks spidering outward as though the house itself was splitting apart. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I grabbed another chair, throwing it into the flames to feed them. The fire spread, climbing the walls, igniting the grotesque tapestries and brittle beams above. Victor's form contorted, his limbs elongating unnaturally as he reached for me. "You can't escape me," he howled, his voice layered with the echoes of countless others. I stumbled back, my vision blurring from the smoke and tears. The room was collapsing, chunks of stone and wood crashing to the ground around me. I could barely see the stairs, but I knew they were my only chance. Summoning every ounce of strength, I turned and ran. The fire roared behind me, a ravenous beast consuming everything in its path. The heat seared my back, and the ground shifted beneath my feet, threatening to pull me into the inferno. As I reached the top of the stairs, the house let out a deafening groan, as if mourning its own destruction. I didn't look back. I burst into the open air, collapsing onto the wet grass outside. Rain poured down, hissing as it met the flames licking out of the shattered windows. My chest heaved, every breath a battle against the smoke still clawing at my lungs. The manor was a blazing pyre, its silhouette crumbling into itself. For a moment, I thought I heard Victor's voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. "Evelyn!" I refused to turn back. The fire consumed the last of the manor, and with it, Victor Aldridge's twisted legacy. But as I lay there, shivering and drenched, a new chill crept into my bones. His final words lingered in my mind, unshakable. "You'll never truly leave." I watched Aldridge Manor burn. Flames licked hungrily at its ancient timbers, roaring into the night like a beast finally unleashed. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying with it the house's secrets, its curses, and, hopefully, Victor Aldridge. The oppressive weight that had clung to my chest since I stepped onto the property began to lift. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe, but the silence was unnerving. No crackling of wood, no distant whispers, only the hiss of rain mingling with the fire. I clutched my knees, shivering in the damp grass, the exhaustion of the night settling into my bones. It was over. It had to be. Yet, in the flickering light of the flames, I felt watched. I shook the thought away. Paranoia had been my constant companion since stepping into the manor, and it wasn't about to release its grip now. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of something lingering just out of sight, waiting for the fire to die down. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. My bag was still slung across my shoulder, heavier now with the journal I'd taken from the house. It felt like a crime to keep it, but leaving it behind seemed worse. If Victor's words were to be believed, his influence didn't end with the house. He claimed he was eternal, his essence carried in the memories and fears of those he touched. I brushed the thought aside and made my way to the car, which felt like the only anchor to reality in this surreal nightmare. Sliding into the driver's seat, I started the engine. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the dirt road ahead. I took one last look in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. The manor was a collapsing skeleton now, its frame devoured by fire. Good riddance. The drive back to town was long and silent. The radio crackled with static, no matter how many times I turned the dial. The rain, though lighter now, tapped insistently on the windshield. My fingers gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I kept expecting something to lurch out of the shadows, to follow me, but the road remained empty. When I reached my apartment, the clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Papers scattered on the desk, a cup half full of cold coffee sitting beside my laptop. Normalcy at last. I tossed my bag onto the couch and collapsed into a chair, staring at the ceiling as adrenaline gave way to exhaustion. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. My name, spoken softly but distinctly. Evelyn. I shot upright, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted to the door. Locked. The windows were shut tight. I told myself it was nothing, a remnant of the night's horrors echoing in my mind. But the sound came again, closer this time. Evelyn. My breath caught. Slowly, I turned toward the source of the sound. The journal lay on the coffee table, its cracked leather cover glinting in the dim light. It hadn't been opened when I dropped it. Now the pages fanned slightly, as if caught in a phantom breeze. I approached it cautiously, every step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder, layering over one another in a cacophony of voices. Some cried, some begged, and one, a smooth, familiar baritone, laughed. Victor. I grabbed the journal and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor, lifeless. The whispers stopped. My apartment was silent once more, save for my ragged breathing. But the feeling of being watched remained. I turned on every light in the apartment, bathing the space in artificial brightness. It didn't help. The shadows seemed darker, more pronounced, curling into corners where the light didn't reach. I felt them stretching toward me, closing the distance between us. Then the mirror above the sink cracked. The sound was sharp, splitting the air like a gunshot. I stared at the jagged lines running through the glass, my reflection distorted. For a moment, I swore I saw another face beside mine, a pale, grinning visage with hollow eyes. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. My voice caught in my throat as the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't coming from the journal anymore. They were everywhere. Evelyn, you'll never truly leave. The lights flickered, plunging the apartment into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the shadows were deeper, more defined, moving in ways they shouldn't. One of them stretched toward me, a long, grasping arm that clawed at the floor as it crept closer. No! I screamed, backing into the corner of the room. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial a number, any number, but the screen remained black. Dead. Just like the power surging through my apartment as the lights finally gave out. In the pitch-black silence, Victor's voice filled the room, deep and resonant. You thought you escaped? You thought fire could stop me? I couldn't see him, but I felt him. His presence was oppressive, a weight pressing down on my chest. The shadows writhed around me, tightening their grip, suffocating me. This is only the beginning, he whispered. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me completely was the faint glow of the journal, its pages flipping wildly as if alive.